two movers and shakers of the greatest generation who changed our world for all time. The first is Albert Einstein. Einstein produced the scientific foundation that opened the nuclear age. Time magazine named Einstein the man of the 20th century. The second is J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer led the scientific team that produced the atomic bomb. And now we depart from two men with super impact on the 1930s and 40s and move on to the other leaders of our greatest generation. Section 1. Political leaders from Hoover to Truman. Former NBC News anchorman Tom Brokaw used print and broadcast journalism to popularize the idea that the generation that survived the Great Depression and won World War II was our greatest American generation. This video scrapbook will furnish a sample of the leaders of the greatest generation in politics, in broadcast journalism, in music, in the movies, and in sports. In politics, Herbert Hoover was the first president in the 1930s. Upon assuming office, he predicted that his administration would bring the final triumph over poverty. At the end of his administration, over 9,000 banks had failed. The unemployment rate was 25%. 50% of the mortgages in America were in default. 1,000 farms were going into foreclosure each day, and 1/3 of our population had no income at all. After the Hoover disaster, we have actual movie footage of Franklin Roosevelt arriving in Washington to assume the presidency. Here it is.
In the days of the Great Depression, FDR's return from vacation, refreshed and deeply tanned, was cheering news. Met by NRA Chief General Hugh S. Johnson, President Roosevelt headed for the Capitol by special train to begin planning a $1.5 billion relief program.
In the face of this monumental business collapse, Franklin D. Roosevelt reinstated a sound banking system, provided work for millions with a barrage of government work relief programs, planted billions of trees and improved the national parks and National Forest Reserve through a National Conservation Corps, improved farm prosperity through an Agriculture Adjustment Act, and provided assistance to the elderly through a Social Security program. Millions of homes, farms, and lives were saved in the Roosevelt administration. By holding the line against complete economic collapse, FDR saved the capitalist system in America, and as Commander-in-Chief in World War II, he was the key figure in saving Western democracy. Roosevelt's military leaders were General George C. Marshall, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, and General Douglas MacArthur, Commander of the Asian Sector. The American people elected FDR 4 times, and in 4 major polls of American historians and political scientists, he is ranked as the greatest president of the 20th century and in the top 3 presidents of all time. Harry S. Truman succeeded to the presidency upon the death of Roosevelt. He presided over final victory in Europe and ended the war against Japan quickly with his decision to use 2 atomic bombs. Roosevelt valued Stalin as an ally in war, but Truman and Stalin could not become allies in peace. Truman adopted a strong policy of containment of communist expansion. This led to an effective free world police action against the aggression of communist North Korea. Truman's containment became the basic United States foreign policy approach for the next 4 decades, and it has been recently adopted by President Biden in our struggle to protect Ukraine. Containment is ridiculed by many today. All-out war is still advocated by those who do not know that in the nuclear age, the world could be destroyed in 45 minutes. Section 2, Prominent Newscasters of the 1930s and 40s. When I was 10 years old, I would listen to KSL on the CBS radio network. An authoritative male voice would dramatically announce, "This is London." It was Edward R. Murrow describing the German bombing of England in World War II. His broadcast was full of static because he was using shortwave radio, and yet he was able to capture the sound of sirens and bombs and buildings collapsing. And he described the brave stand of the British people as they stood alone against Germany. Hitler had conquered the western appendage of Europe. France had fallen, and even Spain was in fascist hands. So the early 40s marked the dramatic entry of young Edward R. Murrow into the elite world of broadcast journalism. These were the first steps of a legendary figure who would become ever more popular in the 50s and 60s. Eric Sevareid was also an elite war correspondent who had been hired by Ed Murrow and the CBS news team. He was the first to report the fall of Paris in 1940. Like Murrow, he had a long and distinguished career in radio and television. He was still an active newsman into the early 1980s. Howard K. Smith was also part of the CBS News team known as Murrow's Boys. His career in radio and television extended into the 1960s. He was the host for the historic first Kennedy-Nixon debate. Elmer Davis was popular on radio during the war years. I personally found his deep, slow drawl a fascinating style for a newsman. H.V. Keltenborn had a vast radio audience in the 1940s. After President Truman's upset victory over Tom Dewey in the election of 1948, President Truman publicly imitated and mocked Keltenborn's coverage of the 1948 election returns. Keltenborn, like most others, had kept reporting all evening that Dewey was certainly going to win. One top story in the 1930s was the political rise of former governor and then Senator Huey Long of Louisiana. Long was an authoritarian radical who berated FDR and his New Deal. He advocated a share our wealth plan, and his campaign song was Every Man a King. Jim Farley, FDR's campaign manager, predicted that Long's presidential bid in 1936 would result in dire consequences for the New Deal. But FDR never faced off with Long. A political enemy in Louisiana assassinated Long before the election of 1936. After that, Roosevelt won all states except Maine and Vermont. Section 3, Music of the 1930s and 40s. The most prolific composer of the music of the 30s and 40s was Cole Porter. This proud Yale grad wrote the Yale Whiffenpoof song and a bevy of catchy popular tunes such as I Love Paris, Anything Goes, You're the Top, You Do Something to Me, Just One of Those Things, I Get a Kick Out of You, Begin the Begin, Night and Day, So in Love, In the Still of the Night, and on and on. Much of Frank Sinatra's material was written by Cole Porter. Rodgers and Hart gave us Funny Valentine, Bewitched, Bothered, and Bewildered, and Blue Moon. Hoagy Carmichael wrote the immortal piece Stardust and the popular Skylark, Georgia on My Mind, and the beautiful ballad The Nearness of You. Duke Ellington not only composed and played sacred music, but he led an orchestra that remained popular for decades. He wrote nearly 3,000 jazz compositions, but is best remembered for Sophisticated Lady, Satin Doll, Mood Indigo, and Solitude. Have you ever seen Frank Sinatra in a movie? Most people have. He had starring roles in Young at Heart, Ocean's 11, Guys and Dolls, Pal Joey, The Manchurian Candidate, The Man with the Golden Arm, and others. But Sinatra is best known as a musical entertainer. He dominated the 20th century as an artist in pop music and was affectionately called Chairman of the Board. Who was called the First Lady of Song? If you answered Ella Fitzgerald, you are right. Ella has performed widely in the United States and abroad. She teamed up with Frank Sinatra and also Mel Torme for memorable duet performances. But perhaps more importantly, she worked with legendary jazz trumpeter Louis Armstrong to produce some permanent quality jazz. A few words about Louis Armstrong. As a child, he fought racism and poverty, and as an adult, Pops triumphantly recorded hit jazz tunes over a period of 50 years. His sweet trumpet and his gravelly voice were his trademarks, and he performed not only with Ella Fitzgerald, but also with fellow jazz enthusiast Bing Crosby. Black jazz artists lightened up the dark days of the Great Depression. Three of these were the talented Billie Holiday, the sassy Sarah Vaughan, and the beautiful Nancy Wilson. In addition to Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, black band leaders such as Count Basie kept our spirits high. Stan Kenton believed that jazz would evolve into classical forms. He therefore composed and played what he called progressive jazz. But the Kenton Orchestra truly became famous because of his vocalist, June Christy. June is shown here watching some friends play baseball. Ina Ray Hutton led a talented, popular, all-girl orchestra in the 1930s. The orchestra was racially mixed. We danced to the pulsating rhythm of Benny Goodman, King of Swing, and the melodic strains of the Glenn Miller Orchestra, and the innovative Artie Shaw Band. Harry James, at one time, featured Frank Sinatra as his vocalist. We followed Judy Garland on a yellow brick road and dreamed with romantic songsters, Bing Crosby, Perry Como, and Nat King Cole. The Hollywood Stage Door Canteen was a place where our movie stars boosted the morale of our men in uniform. Simultaneously, the Andrews Sisters boosted the morale of the home front with songs like the Victory Polka, the Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy from Company C, and Rum and Coca-Cola. The King Sisters kept their songs smooth and sweet. Jerome Kern composed over 700 songs. He impacted the 30s and 40s with tunes such as Old Man River, All the Things You Are, and Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. At this juncture, we must mention Irving Berlin, who wrote over 800 songs. But we are primarily concerned with the music he furnished for the Depression and war years. He introduced God Bless America in 1938 and White Christmas in the early 40s. These were two enormous contributions by Irving Berlin. Swing dance crowds and radio listeners loved the sound of Les Brown and his band of renown. Brown featured the glamorous vocalist Doris Day. Together, they popularized tunes such as Dream, Sentimental Journey, and Saturday Night is the Loneliest Night of the Week. Mel Torme was a jazz singer who could scat with the finest. He was also a talented composer who wrote the California Suite and the famous Christmas song about chestnuts roasting on an open fire. In 1956, Lena Horne won a Grammy Award. In 1984, she won Kennedy Center Honors, and in 1995, she won a Lifetime Achievement Award. In the 1940s, she was a well-established actor in Hollywood and a songstress who popularized the song Stormy Weather. Perry Como had a legendary career as a crooner. His best work came after the 1940s, but in the Truman years, he was famous for his song, Prisoner of Love. Like Perry Como, Rosemary Clooney did her best vocal work and actually became famous after the 1940s. But she did cut about 7 records with the Tony Pastor Band. That was from 1947 to 1949. And some of you will want to know that she was the auntie to George Clooney, the movie star of today. And Julie London makes 3. While she made a few movies and married Jack Webb, the Dragnet star, in the 1940s, it was not until the 1950s that she co-starred with leading men such as Rock Hudson, Robert Taylor, Gary Cooper, and Robert Mitchum. In the 1950s, she also made over 30 jazz albums and had a hit television show in which she played Nurse Dixie McCall. And last is Ray Anthony. whose enchanting theme song was "The Man with a Horn." Ray not only provided dance music for the 40s and 50s, but also the theme song for the radio and television program called Dragnet, and for the soundtrack for 16 Candles. And that's it for our sample of the music of the Depression and war years. Movie stars of the Depression and war years. Movie theaters were the wonderful escape hatches of the 30s and 40s. Most anyone in the country or the city could hide in them for a dime or perhaps 15 cents. The silver screen helped us forget the anxieties of the Great Depression and the horror of World War II. Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald were popular movie stars in the early days of the Depression. They each had backgrounds in opera, and they partnered on screen not only in romantic scenes, but also in beautiful duets. It is time well spent to watch Naughty Marietta, Rose Marie, or Maytime, just for the music. For fantasy and elegance in the 1930s, there was the unforgettable dance team of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Beginning in the early 30s, they co-starred in 10 beautiful movies. The Barclays of Broadway in 1949 was their last picture and the only one in color. Astaire and Rogers is the most watched dance team in history. But who could forget dancer Gene Kelly in Singing in the Rain, or when he teamed with Sinatra in Anchors Away and On the Town. If you needed a laugh, there were great comedy teams. Laurel and Hardy was one of them. They were followed by the Marx Brothers and later by Abbott and Costello. Bob Hope was the most popular movie star comedian. He teamed with the famous vocalist Bing Crosby to star in a number of so-called road shows. Their titles were specifically Road to Singapore, Road to Zanzibar, Road to Morocco, and at least 3 more. W.C. Fields would put on his mittens and deadpan such lines as, "Please excuse me, I must go out and milk my pet elk." And Mae West was a comedian who mastered double entendre as she pushed the boundaries of naughty talk. Fields and West actually co-starred in a 1940 film titled My Little Chickadee. Jack Benny and Red Skelton were popular radio comics who sometimes appeared in movies. Will Rogers stood alone in the field of humor. His jokes were authentic, plain, and mostly political. He was a rodeo trick rope artist. He was a movie star. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He wrote a column for the New York Times, and he was asked to introduce FDR in a huge campaign rally of 1932. But Rogers was tragically killed in an airplane crash in the mid-1930s. Robert Walker was another star whose life was ended too soon. As a high school student, I enjoyed his movie with Ava Gardner called One Touch of Venus. Another fun movie was when Walker co-starred with Judy Garland in The Clock. But Walker's more interesting roles were in Alfred Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train, or as Jerome Kern in the star-studded movie called Till the Clouds Roll By. Gregory Peck was a hit as a patient of a female psychiatrist in the movie Spellbound. Other roles for Gregory Peck in the 40s were as Pa Baxter in The Yearling and General Savage in 12 O'Clock High. Film critics placed two films made in the late 30s and early 40s among the greatest of all time. These were Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, and Citizen Kane, starring Orson Welles. Two other films made at that time have become all-time classics, namely The Wizard of Oz, starring Judy Garland, and Gone with the Wind, starring Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh. John Steinbeck became a Nobel laureate in literature in 1962. Many of his novels were adapted to film. The most prominent of these was The Grapes of Wrath, a story of a migrant farm family, starring Henry Fonda. And now let's transition back to the world of humor. In the 1930s, Joe E. Brown kept us laughing in movies such as Earthworm Tractors and Alibi Ike. And the Three Stooges were solid favorites of those who liked physical farce and slapstick. Funny girl Martha Raye starred in movies such as Rhythm on the Range and Hell's a Poppin'. In the 1940s, the comedy team of Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis established themselves as a nightclub act and performers on radio. When they broke up in the 1950s, Jerry Lewis established himself as a solo act in film, and Dean Martin established himself firmly as a singer and entertainer. The Sinclair Lewis novel, called Cass Timberlane, featured Spencer Tracy and Lana Turner. It was not remarkable in any way except in the matter of the casting. Spencer Tracy was important in many roles in the 1940s. I enjoyed the movies in which he co-starred with Katharine Hepburn, and he was a very believable Thomas Edison in Edison the Man. Mickey Rooney was a credible young Thomas Edison and an effective Huckleberry Finn, and a compelling co-star with young Judy Garland, and even as Andy Hardy. In grammar school, I was part of the largest movie star fan club of all. Johnny Weissmuller had won 5 gold medals as an Olympic swimmer, but in my young mind, he was a hero named Tarzan in 12 wonderful movies of the 30s and 40s. Here are some talented ladies of Hollywood's golden era. First is Bette Davis, who launched her career in the 1940s movies of The Letter, The Little Foxes, and now Voyager. She was nominated for Academy Awards for her first 3 pictures. Second lovely lady of the 30s and 40s was Lana Turner, then Betty Grable, and Rita Hayworth. These were the glamour queens of the glory days of Hollywood. And now we conclude our movie section with one of the most prominent stars of the 1940s. That was Cary Grant. 2 of his many pictures were The Philadelphia Story and The Bachelor and The Bobby Soxer. A few sports personalities of the 1930s and 40s. In the annals of Utah sports glory, there is nothing to equal the winning of 2 national basketball championships in 3 years. But that's exactly what the Running Utes of the University of Utah did in 1944 and 1947. In 1944, 19-year-old freshman Arnie Ferrin led Utah to the NC2A title game against Dartmouth. In that game, Utah prevailed 42-40 in overtime. Ferrin was named Outstanding Player of the Game. In 1947, the Ferrin-led Utes captured the NIT title by defeating Adolph Rupp's celebrated Kentucky Wildcats. In the build-up to the NIT title game, the press gave Utah no chance to defeat Adolph Rupp's famous Fabulous Five. Kentucky's All-American captain, Alex Groza, would lead the Wildcats to national championships in 1948 and 1949, but not in 1947. When he, that is, Alex Groza, matched up with Utah center Vern Gardner It was Gardner who won the title of the NIT's most valuable player. In scoring, Gardner made 15 points to Groza's 12. And in rebounding, Gardner was visibly much better. Kentucky's high-scoring, unstoppable All-American guard was Ralph Beard. He was 5 foot 10 inches tall. Later, he would win a gold medal as a member of a U.S. Olympic basketball team. He would also play professionally. But in the NIT title game, Beard would be matched up with Utah's guard, Wat Masaka. Masaka was only 5 feet 7 inches tall, and he wore a size 7 shoe. Masaka would only score 2 points in the game, but he held high-scoring Ralph Beard to a single point. Kentucky's power forward, Jim Line, would be named All-American in 1949. In 47 against Utah, he scored 12 points. But Utah's forward, Arnie Ferrin, would score 15. The final score in the NIT championship game of 1947 was Utah 49, Kentucky 45. Four-time All-American Arnie Ferrin would go on to play professionally with the Minneapolis Lakers. So would the legendary George Mikan. In the late 40s, 6 foot 11-inch Mikan was one of a kind. By comparison, in the 21st century, 6 foot 11 basketball players are commonplace. In the early 1930s, James J. Braddock was heavyweight champion of the world. A compelling modern movie titled Cinderella Man furnishes us with an inspiring account of Braddock, who was a great champion in life as well as in the ring. Braddock lost the heavyweight title to Joe Louis. Nicknamed the Brown Bomber, Louis held the title from 1938 to 1949, the longest in U.S. history. For part of this time, Joe Louis served in the U.S. Army and fought exhibition matches throughout the country for the entertainment of us all. In baseball, 3 of the big names were shortstop Mickey Mantle of the New York Yankees, center fielder Joe DiMaggio, who also played for the Yankees, and outfielder and first baseman Stan Musial, who played for the St. Louis Cardinals. And then there was left fielder Ted Williams of the Boston Red Sox. Teddy Ballgame was the last player to hit over .400 in a season. A sample of collegiate football stars of the 1940s should begin with quarterback Frankie Albert of Stanford, who led his 1940 team to the Rose Bowl. Next, there is Johnny Lujack of Notre Dame, who won the Heisman Trophy in 1947. Eddie LeBaron, quarterback at tiny University of Pacific in Stockton, California, unbelievably became All-American in 1949. And Doak Walker, halfback at SMU, won the Heisman Trophy in 1949. And that is a small sample of sports personalities of the 30s and 40s. And now let's fast forward to a small Utah town called Mount Pleasant. It was March 26, 1947, and students were assembling for our 8 o'clock class in our seminary building. I took two close buddies aside and told them the Utah Utes defeated the Kentucky Wildcats for the national title on March 24th, and the champs were scheduled to arrive at the Salt Lake City airport in 2.5 hours. I told them I was going to hitchhike to Salt Lake to meet the Utes when they arrived. They both agreed to go with me, so we walked out of our classroom, went to the front of our high school, and stuck our thumbs out. Up rolled a big 1.5-ton flatbed truck. It stopped, and two men in it asked us where we were going. We told them where and why. They told us they were headed for Salt Lake, and they invited us to jump up on the back of the truck. We did so, and we were happily on our way. Our destination was about 100 miles north, and to cope with the cold March wind, we buried our heads in our jackets and zipped them up tight. I am certain that the kind gentleman in the truck had no intention of taking the circuitous route of the Salt Lake Airport for their own trip to the city, but for us, they went directly to the airport and dropped us off in time to see the Utah team disembark from their flight. We were part of the festivities at the airport, where 5,000 of us saw the University of Utah Convertible Club furnish each team member with a convertible decked out in red and white with his name on it. And leading this parade downtown was Vern Gardner, the NIT's most valuable player. Vern was seated astride Big Dan, the city's largest fire engine. Utah was celebrating more than the NIT victory that day. 1947 was Utah's centennial year. So, according to the Salt Lake Tribune, people were lined up 10 deep along the streets of the city. Governor Herbert B. Ma addressed the rally in the central city, as did Mayor Earl J. Glade and officials from the university. A goodly portion of the crowd then moved to Kingsbury Hall on the university campus for another rally and an address by A. Ray Olpen, president of Utah University. At this juncture, we began to think about food and a ride back to Mount Pleasant. A financial inventory revealed we had 15 cents for dinner for 3. We bought a loaf of bread and divided it between us. We had plenty of delicious water that bubbled up continuously from the many drinking fountains along the streets of the central city. We were fortunate to hitch a ride home rather easily, but there were challenges at NSI upon our return. I made my relationship with school authorities worse when I told them I would do it again. To make an unpleasant story short, I found a new high school in Salt Lake City for my senior year. But my personal participation in the NIT victory celebration is peripheral to the story of the Utah basketball team. And here they are, from left to right. Wat Masaka, guard. Fred Widener, guard. Arnold Farron, forward. Vern Gardner, center. And Leon Watson, forward. Beautiful kids and golden memories. Furthermore, the story of the Utah basketball team is peripheral to the story of the movers and shakers of the greatest generation. I use the phrase greatest generation with certitude and pride, but with a personal disclaimer. I was born in 1930 and was too young to make any significant contribution to the resolution of the Great Depression. And when World War II ended, I had just turned 15. But I experienced the Depression and World War II in real time. I saw mass poverty, ration books, casualty lists, and the suffering of the people who earned the title, the greatest generation. It has been my great pleasure to assemble a video scrapbook of that flawed but gallant generation. The end.